What does a man own when the number on a screen defining his worth finally hits zero? The private Gulf Stream, a ghost of polished silver and leather, was already a memory. The penthouse that scraped the clouds, with its art that cost more than hospitals, was just a set of empty rooms awaiting new owners. The name Alexander Vance no longer opened doors. Instead, it triggered a chorus of closing ones, the heavy, final thud of opportunity lost. On a damp Tuesday morning, he stood on the curb outside a budget motel, the kind with flickering neon and the faint, permanent smell of bleach and regret. In his hand, he clutched a single, worn leather duffel bag containing everything he still possessed. The weight of it was insulting. This was the moment after the avalanche. The news channels had moved on to fresher scandals. The bankruptcy courts had picked his empire clean, and the friends, the sycophants, the allies, the hangers-on had evaporated like puddles in a sudden drought. Their numbers were deleted from his new, cheap phone, a device that hadn't rung in days. Silence was his new kingdom. The only thing louder was the phantom echo of a life that had been a constant, screaming tinnitus of loss. He'd met her, Alara, at the peak. It was at a gallery opening in Monaco, a sea of champagne and calculated smiles. He was the lion of the hour, surrounded by a pride of those who wanted a piece of his light. And then he saw her. She wasn't looking at him, but at a small, overlooked painting in a corner, a simple depiction of a storm-bent tree. She stood with a stillness that was alien to the room. He, a master of acquisition, had wanted that stillness for himself. He charmed, he dazzled, he deployed the full arsenal of his wealth and wit. She was hesitant, a librarian with a poet's soul, unimpressed by the roar of the crowd. But he was persistent, and eventually she let him in. She was his sanctuary from the deal-making frenzy, the one person who didn't want a signature, a favor, a piece of the legend. He never quite understood what she saw in him, the man behind the money, and in his quieter moments the thought terrified him. Now he was just a man with a duffel bag and a motel key. The room was as expected, thin walls transmitting the muffled sounds of a television game show, a bedspread with a pattern that fought with the carpet, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning in protest. He opened the duffel, a change of clothes, a passport, a titanium wristwatch, the one he'd been wearing the day it all collapsed. It was the only artifact, a relic from a sunken civilization. He ran his thumb over its cool, smooth surface. This was it. The sum total of Alexander Vance. A soft knock at the door broke the spell. It wasn't the aggressive rap of a bill collector or the weary shuffle of the motel manager. It was a familiar, tentative rhythm. His heart, a numb muscle in his chest, gave a single hard thud. He opened the door, and there she was, Alara. Her hair was damp from a fine, misty rain, her simple coat beaded with water. In her hands she held 2 paper bags from a grocery store. The sight of her in this place, this shrine to his failure, was so profoundly wrong it felt like a dream. "You found me," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "It wasn't that hard," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "You're not exactly hiding, you're just here." She stepped inside, her eyes doing a quick, compassionate scan of the room. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer a pitying look. She just set the bags down on the small, scarred table. "I brought food and coffee, real coffee." He watched, speechless, as she unpacked. A loaf of bread, some cheese, fruit, a container of soup from a decent deli, to large paper cups of coffee. It was the most mundane of acts, but in that room it felt more monumental than any corporate takeover he had ever engineered. "You shouldn't be here, Alara," he finally managed. "You should be as far away from me, as possible." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her gaze clear and direct. "Where else would I be?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. He had no answer. He had prepared for her departure, braced for it. Her presence was the variable his broken mind couldn't compute. "I have nothing," he stated. The words a stark, unadorned fact. "The apartments, the cars, the company, the investments. It's all gone. They're even contesting the offshore trusts. I am, for all intents and purposes, a pauper, a 37-year-old man who has to start over from less than zero." Alara poured the coffee, the rich, aromatic steam a stark contrast to the room's stale air. She handed him a cup. "You're forgetting something." "What? What could I possibly still have you?" she said. "And me." He wanted to laugh, a bitter, hollow sound, but it caught in his throat. He looked at her, truly looked at her. She wasn't the same as the woman in Monaco. The soft, curated life he'd provided for her was gone. There was a new resilience in her eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. The storm had reached her, too. For the next week, a strange new routine established itself. Alara came every day. She brought food, helped him scour online. Job listings, a humiliating exercise for a man who used to create jobs by the thousands, and simply sat with him in the quiet. She was a rock in the raging river of his despair. Why was she here? What was her angle? In his world, every action had a motive, a desired return on investment. One evening, as they shared a simple pasta dish from a takeout container, he voiced the suspicion gnawing at him. "Did you know?" he asked, his voice low. About the collapse. Did you see it coming? Did you move any assets? Is that what this is? The moment the words left his mouth, he felt a flush of shame. But the old Alexander, the Wolf of Wall Street, needed to know. Ilara put her fork down slowly. She didn't look hurt, just tired. You think this is a negotiation? She stood up and started clearing the table. I'm not one of your deals. I'm not an asset to be managed or a liability to be shed. I have nothing to offer you. Nothing. And yet, you're here, in this hellhole, wasting your time on a lost cause. What do you want? For the first time, he saw a flicker of something else in her gaze, not anger, but a deep, ancient sorrow. But you're not ready. You're still looking at the world through a balance sheet. She pulled her wrist away gently, finished cleaning up, and left without another word. The room felt colder, emptier than ever before. Alexander paced the cramped room, his mind a torment of self-recrimination and renewed suspicion. Or was her absence the final, confirming piece of evidence that her presence had always been a calculation, one that had just failed to pay off? He needed to get out. He left the motel and walked, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his thinning coat. He walked for miles, through neighborhoods he would never have seen from the tinted windows of his maid. His feet, acting on a memory his mind had tried to bury, carried him to a part of the city he hadn't visited in years. He found himself standing across the street from a small, independent bookstore. It was called The Last Chapter. She was wearing an apron, talking to a customer with a warm, easy smile. This wasn't a woman visiting a pitiful ex-billionaire in a motel. As he watched, hidden in the shadow of a doorway, a man emerged from the back of the shop. The man placed a familiar, comfortable hand on the small of her back, a gesture of easy intimacy. She hadn't stayed out of loyalty or love. She had a life, a good one. The mystery of her loyalty had just deepened into something darker. And as he stood there watching her normal, happy life, but in the terrifying, unanswered question of what the woman who stayed behind truly wanted, the pleasant chime of the bookstore's door was a gunshot in the quiet canyon of Alexander's mind. He watched, frozen, as the man with the easy smile locked up, as he and Ilara stood for a moment on the sidewalk, talking in the fading afternoon light. He saw the man lean in, press a kiss to her cheek, and then walk away, whistling a tune that Alexander couldn't hear but could perfectly imagine. Ilara watched him go, a soft, unreadable expression on her face, before turning and walking in the opposite direction, towards the motel, towards him. She was coming back. The contradiction was a physical ache in his chest, the cozy scene in the bookstore, the intimate touch, the normalcy of it, all it painted a picture of a life moving on, a life that had no room for a bankrupt man in a rented room. Yet, her footsteps were leading her back to that very room. Why? The question was a frantic drumbeat in his skull, louder and more urgent than any stock ticker. He moved before she could arrive, a ghost retreating back to his tomb. By the time her familiar knock came, he was sitting in the same chair, the duffel bag at his feet, his face a carefully constructed mask of weary acceptance. He opened the door. Hey, she said, offering a small, tired smile. She held up a brown paper bag. I brought you a book. Thought you might be bored. He took it, his fingers brushing against hers. The gesture felt charged now, laden with a new and terrible meaning. The book was a classic, something about survival and resilience. He wondered if it was a message. Thank you, he said, his voice flat. He gestured for her to come in. The room seemed smaller than ever, the walls pressing in with the weight of his new knowledge. She sat on the edge of the bed, looking at him with that quiet, penetrating gaze. You went for a walk. Your coat is damp. I needed air. He paused, the question a burning coal on his tongue. He had to be careful. To reveal he had been watching her was to reveal the depth of his paranoia, the crumbling state of his trust. What did you do today? He asked, feigning casual disinterest. Ilara looked down at her hands, then back at him. I was at work. Work, he let the word hang, a baited hook. I got a job, she said, meeting his eyes a few weeks ago at a bookstore. It's not much, but it helps. A bookstore. Alexander repeated the words as if they were in a foreign language. That's good. I'm glad you're moving on. The statement was a test, delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Her eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the shift in his tone. It's not about moving on, Alex. It's about paying my rent. My rent, the one you haven't been able to cover for the past month. The blow landed with stunning precision. He had been so consumed with his own catastrophic loss, he had never stopped to consider the practicalities of her life. The apartment he'd paid for, the credit cards, the allowances, it was all gone. Of course she needed a job. The realization was another layer of humiliation. He had failed her in this, too. I didn't realize, he stammered, the billionaire reduced to a chastised child. I know you didn't, she said, her voice softening. You've been in the eye of your own storm, but the rest of the world, my world, it kept spinning. Bills needed to be paid. He looked at the book in his hands, then back at her. The man's face, the hand on her back, flashed in his mind. And him, the man at the bookstore. Ilara went very still. What about him? He seemed familiar with you. A long, heavy silence filled the room. He could see her processing this, her mind working behind her eyes. His name is David. she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. He's the owner. He's been kind. Kind, Alexander echoed, the word tasting like ash. In his world, kindness was a transaction. He looked more than kind. Alex, she said, a warning note in her voice. Don't what, he snapped, the dam of his control finally breaking. Don't question why you're here, playing nurse to a ruined man, when you have a kind man and a perfectly good life waiting for you just a few blocks away. What is this, Alara? A charity case? A final project before you move on to something simpler? Or is it guilt? He was shouting now, the pent-up frustration and fear of weeks boiling over. He saw her flinch, but she didn't back down. She stood up, her own anger a cold, sharp thing. Guilt, she fired back, her voice low and dangerous. What would I possibly feel guilty about? Your empire was built on sand long before I ever met you. I didn't sign the loans. I didn't make the reckless bets. I was the one who told you to slow down, to be careful. Remember. He did remember. The quiet warnings over dinner, the concerned looks when he'd talk about another leveraged buyout. He had dismissed it as her not understanding the game, the glorious high-stakes game he was winning. Then why, he pleaded, the anger draining out of him, leaving only a raw, bewildered exhaustion. Just tell me why you're here. I can't figure out the angle. There's always an angle. Ilara looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not pity, not anger, but a profound, heartbreaking disappointment. That's the tragedy, Alexander. You're so busy looking for the angle. You're blind to the truth sitting right in front of you. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. She didn't look back. David is my brother. He bought that bookstore with the small inheritance our grandmother left me. The inheritance you never knew about, because it wasn't part of your world. It was mine. It's the only thing that's kept me afloat since everything. The revelation landed like a depth charge, shaking the very foundations of his reality. The intimate touch, the easy comfort, it was familial. He had been so poisoned by his own cynicism, so trapped in a world of transactional relationships, that he had mistaken simple, human love for a conspiracy. She opened the door, the humid evening air rushing in. I stayed because I believed the man I fell in love with in Monaco was still in there, buried under all the money and the power. I thought if all that was stripped away, I might finally get to meet him. Her voice broke slightly, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe the money didn't bury him, maybe it created him. And what's left now is just the shell it built itself around. She stepped out into the night, pulling the door closed behind her with a soft, final click. Alexander stood alone in the silence, the truth of her words echoing in the hollowed-out chamber of his heart. He had lost his fortune, his status, his name, but as he stared at the closed door, he was gripped by the terrifying realization that he was on the verge of losing something infinitely more valuable, and that this loss, unlike all the others, would be entirely unforgivably his own fault. The fight wasn't to get his money back, it was a desperate last-ditch battle to prove that the man she believed might exist actually did, and he had no idea how to even begin. The click of the door was the sound of a vault ceiling shut, locking him in with the crushing weight of his own folly. For a long time Alexander didn't move. The motel room, once a symbol of his fall, now felt like a confession booth where he had just admitted to a sin he didn't even know he was capable of. He had become a ghost in his own life, so disconnected from reality that he could no longer recognize simple, human loyalty. David is my brother. The words echoed, each repetition a hammer blow to the foundation of his paranoia. He saw the scene again, the hand on her back, the easy laugh, but now, through the new, clarifying lens of truth, it was transformed. It wasn't intimacy, it was family. It was a safety net he had never known, a bond that existed outside of credit lines and asset portfolios. He had been so busy auditing her motives, he'd failed to see the balance sheet of her heart was written in a language he'd never bothered to learn. He looked at his hands, the hands that had once signed billion-dollar deals. Now, they were just hands. Empty, useless. They had held nothing of real value, and in their grasping they had pushed away the one thing that was. A cold, clear resolve began to cut through the fog of his self-pity. This was no longer about losing a fortune. It was about losing himself. Alara was right. The money hadn't buried the man she'd loved. It had created a facsimile of one, a gilded golem that walked and talked and acquired, but never truly was. The golem was now broken, its gold leaf peeling away to reveal the crude, unfinished clay beneath. The question was there anything real underneath it all? Or was it just hollow, all the way down? He couldn't stay in this room. The four walls were a cage of his own making. He shoved a few belongings from the duffel into the pockets of his coat, his passport, his watch, the book she had brought him. He left the key on the table and walked out, not as a man fleeing his failure, but as a man stepping onto a new, terrifying battlefield. The city at night was a different creature. The sharp, competitive daylight was gone, replaced by a softer, more indifferent darkness. He walked without a destination, his breath pluming in the chill air. He found himself drawn to the river that cut through the city, a slow black ribbon under the bruised purple sky. He stood on the bridge, watching the lights of the skyscrapers he used to own twinkle in the water, their reflections shimmering and broken. He took the titanium watch from his pocket. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a monument to precision and status. In his old life, it was a signal to others. Now, it was just a weight. He held it over the dark flowing water, his fingers clenched around the cold metal. Letting it go would be a ritual, a final physical severance from the man he had been, but his hand froze. A different thought, insidious and sharp, pierced through his resolve. The inheritance. Alara's words came back to him. He bought that bookstore with a small inheritance our grandmother left me. The inheritance you never knew about. A small inheritance, a bookstore, a simple, honest life. But his mind, a machine built for patterns and risk assessment, began to whir back to life, against his will. The collapse of his empire hadn't been a simple market correction. It had been a targeted, systematic dismantling. A rival, Silas Thorne, had been circling for months, but Alexander had been confident his defenses were impenetrable. Yet Thorne had found every weak spot, anticipated every move, as if he had a blueprint. There had been a leak, a betrayal from the inside. The investigators were still looking, but with the company in ruins, the trail had gone cold. An inheritance you never knew about. How much? When exactly did she get it? The timing of their meeting, her initial reluctance. Had it been a calculated approach? What if her loyalty wasn't about love or guilt, but about something far darker? What if she, or her brother, had been working with Thorne? A small investment for a massive payout. Her staying now, her unwavering presence. It was the perfect cover. Who would ever suspect the grieving, loyal girlfriend? It was a long con of breathtaking audacity. The watch felt heavy in his hand, no longer a symbol of his past, but a potential key to a more terrifying truth. He wasn't just a ruined man. He was perhaps a pawn in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. He slowly pulled his hand back from the railing, slipping the watch back into his pocket. The cold metal seemed to leach the warmth from his skin. He turned away from the water and started walking, his pace quickening, his mind a storm of chaotic, horrifying calculations. The emotional clarity he'd felt moments before was gone, obliterated by the return of his oldest and most faithful companion. Suspicion. It was a poison, but it was also a familiar armor. He needed answers he couldn't ask her. Any question would now be a declaration of war. He had to find another way. He looked up at the skyline, at Thorne's corporate tower, a needle of arrogant light piercing the night. The battle wasn't over. It had just shifted. He had been fighting the wrong enemy, mourning the wrong loss. The real mystery was no longer why Alara stayed. The real, chilling mystery was what she was truly guarding, or what she was waiting for. And as Alexander Vance melted into the shadows of the city, a new purpose, cold and sharp and devoid of the hope he'd felt just minutes before, began to take root. He was going to find out. Even if it destroyed the last fragile thing he had left. The city's hum was no longer a passive sound. It was a current of data, and Alexander was a node tuned to a single, terrifying frequency: betrayal. The clarity of his self-loathing had been a luxury. This new suspicion was a sharper, more familiar agony. It didn't paralyze him, it armed him. The man who had built an empire on discerning hidden patterns was back, his instincts sharpened by desperation. He didn't return to the motel. That chapter was closed. Instead, he found a 24-hour internet cafe tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop, its air thick with the smell of stale coffee and loneliness. He paid for an hour with the last of the crumpled cash from his duffel bag, the coins feeling alien and insignificant in his palm. He started with David and Elara. Their last name was Iverson. It was a name he realized he'd rarely used, had never bothered to investigate. A few keystrokes brought up a local news article from 2 years ago. Siblings fulfill grandmother's dream. Opened the last chapter. There was a photo of them, younger, their arms linked, standing in front of the bookstore's freshly painted facade. He zoomed in. Alara's smile was the same, but her eyes held a hope he recognized from their earliest days. David's face was open, earnest. Alexander searched for the cunning, the avarice he was now convinced must be there, but found only a quiet pride. He dug deeper, into property records, business filings, the inheritance. It was there, a transfer from a probate court, $150,000, a sum that, in his old life, he would have tipped a waiter for exceptional service. To them it was a life-changing foundation. The timeline was clean. The money had cleared 6 months before he met Alara. His theory wavered. The foundation was laid before he was even in the picture. Coincidence or meticulous planning? He opened a new tab, his fingers hesitating over the keys. Silas Thorne, his rival's smug, patrician face filled the screen from a recent Forbes article, gloating over the Vance liquidation. Alexander's jaw tightened. He began cross-referencing a mad archaeologist digging for a connection that might not exist. Thorne's holding companies, his shell corporations, his charitable donations. He searched for any transaction, any point of contact with the name Iverson. An hour bled away. The cafe computer flashed a low-time warning. He was chasing phantoms, building a conspiracy out of the random noise of the universe. The weight of his foolishness began to settle back on him. He was a ruined man seeing monsters in the shadows of his own ruin. Then he saw it. It wasn't a direct payment. It was a donation. a substantial one, made by a Thorne family philanthropic foundation 18 months ago. The recipient was a small, obscure literary non-profit, and listed on the non-profit's board of directors as the treasurer was David Iverson. The air left Alexander's lungs. The connection was thin, circumstantial, a single thread in a vast tapestry. But to a man drowning in suspicion, it was a lifeline made of barbed wire. A donation to a non-profit David was involved with. It could be innocent patronage, but it could also be a payment, a way to funnel money, to buy loyalty, to plant an asset. His mind raced, stitching the narrative together. David, needing capital for his bookstore, gets approached. Thorne provides the funds through a disguised donation, and in return, David's sister gets close to the target. She is the perfect weapon. Beautiful, intelligent, unassuming. She learns his habits, his vulnerabilities, the architecture of his financial defenses. She was the Trojan horse, and he had willingly wheeled her into the heart of his kingdom. The computer screen went black. His time was up. Alexander sat in the sudden darkness, the only light the garish neon from the pawn shop next door, casting a sickly red glow across his face. The pieces fit. They fit with a horrifying, elegant precision that felt more true than any declaration of love ever had. He stood, his body moving on autopilot. He walked out into the night, the city sounds muffled as if he were underwater. He knew what he had to do. He had to confront her, but not with anger, not with accusations. He had to be smarter than that. He had to be the strategist he once was. He found a payphone, a relic he hadn't used in decades, and called her. He used the voice he reserved for calming nervous investors, a voice of measured, weary calm. "Elara," he said when she answered, her voice tentative, guarded. "I'm sorry, I'm lost, and I took it out on you. It was unforgivable." He paused, letting the silence hang, a calculated display of vulnerability. "Can we talk?" "Not at the motel. Somewhere neutral. The park. By the fountain, please." There was a long silence on the other end. He could hear her breathing, could almost feel her weighing his words, searching for the trap. "Okay," she said finally, her voice soft with a caution that felt, to him, like confirmation of her guilt. 1 hour. He hung up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The stage was set. The park at night was a place of shadows and whispers, the perfect backdrop for an ambush. He would go there not as a heartbroken man, but as a prosecutor. He would lay out the facts, the timeline, the donation. He would watch her eyes for the flicker of confession. He arrived early, positioning himself in the deep shadow of a large oak tree, the fountain a shimmering specter in the center of the clearing. The air was cold, the sound of the water a constant, soothing murmur that belied the tension coiling inside him. He rehearsed his lines, the calm, devastating logic that would tear her story apart. Then he saw her. She walked into the circle of light around the fountain, her coat pulled tight against the chill. She looked small, alone, and heartbreakingly beautiful. For a fleeting second, his conviction wavered. What if he was wrong? What if this was the final, catastrophic error from which there would be no return? But then he saw it. A second figure, taller, emerging from the path on the opposite side of the park. David, he was here. She hadn't come alone. She had brought her brother, her accomplice. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The proof. They were coming together to face him down, to maintain the lie, or perhaps to end it. He watched as Elara turned, saw her brother, and her body language shifted from apprehension to visible surprise. She hadn't expected him either. They met by the fountain, their conversation too quiet for Alexander to hear, their postures tense, confused. This was the moment. His pulse thundered in his ears. He stepped out from the shadows, the words of accusation ready on his tongue. A final, terrible judgment he was poised to deliver. He took one step, then another, the gravel crunching under his feet like breaking bones. Elara looked up, her eyes wide, meeting his across the dark expanse of the park. In that frozen sliver of time, he saw not guilt, but a dawning, horrified understanding of what was about to happen, and he knew, with a certainty that turned his blood to ice, that once he spoke the next words, there would be no going back for any of them. The fountain's murmur was the only voice left, a gentle, indifferent music for a universe that had just been remade. Alexander stood there long after Elara's form had been swallowed by the night, the cold seeping through his thin coat, a physical echo of the chill that had taken root in his soul. The grand conspiracy had evaporated, leaving a truth far more devastating in its simplicity. He had been the architect of his own isolation. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. He just watched the water, the way it caught the light and fractured it. 1,000 shimmering possibilities that always fell back into the dark, unified whole. His life had been the opposite, a single, blinding point of light that, upon shattering, had revealed it was composed of nothing but broken, scattered pieces. He thought of the watch in his pocket, the last artifact of his kingdom. He didn't need to throw it into the river anymore. Its weight was no longer a symbol of what he'd lost, but a paperweight holding down the lesson of this entire, brutal education. Value was not assigned, it was built. It was earned in the quiet, unobserved moments, in the choices made when no one was watching and no profit was to be had. He turned and walked away from the fountain, his steps slow but deliberate. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time, The not knowing wasn't a source of panic. It was a blank page. The city looked different in the pre-dawn gloom. The sharp, aggressive edges were softened. He saw the bakery just turning on its lights. The baker already dusted in flour, creating something simple and essential. He saw a street sweeper moving with a rhythmic, meditative grace, cleansing the city of yesterday's grime. These were not small lives, they were foundational. They were the bedrock upon which towers were built, and upon which men like him eventually fell. He found himself as if pulled by an invisible thread, standing across the street from the last chapter. The bookstore was dark, its display window a quiet promise of other worlds, other lives. This was her world, a world built not on leverage, but on stories, not on acquisition, but on meaning. He had tried to buy his way into it, and in doing so had proven himself unworthy of the price of admission. He didn't wait for her. He didn't try to see her. His presence there was not a demand, but an acknowledgement, a silent salute to the thing he had failed to understand. As the first hint of sun bled into the horizon, turning the sky from black to a deep, bruised blue, he began to walk. He walked until he found a construction site, a skeleton of steel and concrete reaching for the sky. A foreman was there, sipping coffee from a thermos, his breath pluming in the cold air. "You hiring?" Alexander asked, his voice rough. The foreman looked him up and down, taking in the expensive but now ruined shoes, the coat that was too thin for labor. "You got any experience?" "No," Alexander said, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. "But I learned fast. And I'm not afraid of hard work." It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a scheme to win her back. It was the first brick. The most important one. The one you lay when you have nothing, for no other reason than it is the only honest thing left to do. The foreman nodded slowly. "Be here at 7. We'll see." Alexander nodded his thanks and turned away. The sun was properly rising now, painting the glass towers in hues of gold and rose. He didn't look at them with envy or regret. They were just buildings. His kingdom was gone, but in its place was something he had never truly possessed before, a foundation. It was raw, it was muddy, and it was painfully, beautifully real. He was no longer Alexander Vance, the billionaire. He was just a man with empty hands, standing at the very beginning, finally understanding that everything he had ever truly needed to build a life had been there all along, waiting in the quiet, steadfast heart of a woman who had seen a glimmer of something real, and had dared to believe it could be saved. The question that remained, the one that would linger long after this story was told, was not what a man owns when he loses everything, but what he is finally free to become.